Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another episode of Books and Looks. Yes, this is our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and authors I've been interviewing. And today, we're going to be talking with Madeline Martin, who comes to us from St. Augustine, Florida, in the midst of the hurricane. Just went through. She's here to talk to us about her newest book. I'm going to put it right here for you. The Book Lover's Library, wonderful historical fiction. And as we say, it's almost more history than fiction. You'll learn a lot about the beginnings of World War II in England. It's set in Nottingham, England. It's wonderful. It's a great, great book filled with wonderful characters, both main characters and supporting characters, which we get into. And it's all about a lending library. Yeah. I didn't even know about such thing as a lending library when this started. So, you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot when you read Madeline's book. She does a wonderful, wonderful job. Hey, look at us, though. What is this? We've changed. Yes, we've changed locations. If you're saying, what is it? It's my library. That's right. There's just a little bit of my library behind you. We're here. We've got a new website coming out called booksandlookspodcast.com. We got a new site here, new views here, and we're coming to you. I hope everything sounds good, looks good. We're trying this out today. I think it's going to be a winner here. We're trying to make things the best experience we can for you. So, hey, you know what's the best experience? Going right to that interview with Madeline Martin. Hello, Madeline.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me back, Blaine.
Well, we are happy you made it through Hurricane Milton and no problems where you're at.
Thankfully, no. We still have a lot of rain and wind right now, but it's mainly just sort of the arms of the hurricane. The hurricane itself has passed, thank goodness. So I know I have power for this, and that's really all I needed to make sure I had.
That's great. Well, last week it was me. This week it's you. So, you never know what's going to happen with the weather right now. But, this is a wonderful book and I notice that most all your books are set over in Europe. Now, do you go over to Europe to do the research? And specifically, did you go to England for this book?
Absolutely. I have been very fortunate to get to do travel for almost all of my historical fiction. The only one I haven't been able to do was The Last Bookshop in London because I wrote it during the pandemic when like everything was completely closed. But so for the Book Lovers Library, I did get to go to Nottingham. And, it was a really, really wonderful experience. I got to go and see where the real Book Lovers Library, the very first Book Lovers Library, was located in Nottingham. Unfortunately, the interior is now a Zara. So it's just kind of these glossy white walls and lights and kind of has no soul. But the outside of the building is still really lovely with the scrolling stonework and stained glass windows and a really lovely sort of clock on the corner of the building. I got to see a real lending library in action at Bromley House, which it's from the 1800s. That's when it really originated, but the house itself is from the 17th century, is a four-story townhouse, and it was just really, really cool. And I got to go down in the caves all through Nottingham that people sheltered in during the Blitz. So I got to have a really lot of incredible experiences personally that I was able to incorporate into the book.
I know last book you over in Poland, you got extensive notes for that when your trip over there. So I had assumed you'd be in England, but just wanted to make sure. That's great.
Yes.
You get that local flavor and color. You understand things more than just say, "Oh, I hear it is on the internet."
Absolutely, yes. And also, there's a lot more reading material available on site than you can find anywhere else. And that really is integral to my research as well. So whenever I travel, I always pack a packable suitcase inside of my main suitcase. So I go over with one bag and I fly back with two bags because one of them is completely filled with books and then packed around with all my dirty clothes to make sure that they don't get messed up.
Well, I said to you, and I say to many others, I think this is like the second stage of your writing career. You began basically doing the historical romance type books, and now you are doing heavy historical fiction to the point where I think it's almost more history than fiction. Was that a purposeful choice by you?
I actually fell in love as a reader with historical fiction. My first book that I read that I can really remember just absolutely losing myself in was Laura Ingalls Wilder's The Little House in the Big Woods. And I think I've just loved historical fiction ever since. And so when I started to write historical romance, it was, of course, the history is important, but it's not as important as it is with historical fiction. And I think I was a little bit intimidated to start trying to write historical fiction because of how immersive one really has to be into the time period. And writing the last bookshop in London with my first historical fiction, I realized that I really love that historical research. So I'm not just a history nerd, I'm also a research nerd. And I really think at this point, if I never had a deadline for my books, I probably would research a book for like 25 years before even starting to write it. So it's probably a good thing that I do have deadlines because my bills still need to be paid.
Don't you know that? No doubt about that. Well, a lot of people, when they look at this, they'll see the title, The Book Lover's Library. A lot of people are thinking, romantic history, romantic fiction, cozy. It's not. It's not at all. It's, excuse me. No, it's based upon an actual lending library over in England. I think it's called Boots Book Lovers Library, if I'm not mistaken. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Boots Chemist is actually still all over England today. And they really originated sort of in the late 1800s. And it's just sort of like if you'd imagine like a Walgreens or a CVS. And when Jesse Boots, the owner of Jesse Boot, the owner of the Boots Chemist, married his wife, she actually was the daughter of a bookseller. And so it was kind of her idea to say, well, why don't we incorporate books into the Boots Chemist and maybe have a lending library? And before this, lending libraries were kind of basement dark spaces. It really was not inviting. And with libraries, they considered libraries to be very like filled with germs. And they felt like a lot of the books there were not really novels. Like I feel like the novel was really having its day, like the romances and the mysteries, like the sort of voracious the books that voracious readers love to just dig into. And so lending libraries were really made this one specifically was almost made for the upper middle class, where you could purchase an annual subscription for essentially the cost of a paperback novel and have access to all of these books throughout the year. You had your Class A subscribers who paid a little bit more and expected a lot more. And you also had your Class B subscribers who had to wait until the book had been released for a year before they could actually borrow it themselves. But I think one of the coolest things about the book lovers libraries inside of the Boots Chemist is that it was really such a transportive experience. So you would walk into, like I said, if you would imagine a CVS or a Walgreens for our American listeners, and you walk in and you go either all the way to the very back of the store or to the second floor, wherever the book lovers library was located, and you were completely transported into a bookish paradise with these lovely thick pile carpets, fresh cut flowers, stained glass windows, and just shelves and shelves and shelves of all of these wonderful books. In fact, all of the books had little punctures at the very top of the spine, like a little eyelet. And that was there because the token that people would use for their membership was threaded through with a ribbon. And it would go through that eyelet, and you could use it as a bookmark and make sure that you didn't lose your membership token. So I wanted to make sure when they did the cover for this book, they, of all the covers that are listed on, shown on the shelves, one of them does have a puncture mark at the very top. And that's really to indicate the book lovers library books.
Okay. But now there's a B subscriber. What did the B subscriber get?
Well, so they didn't necessarily have as curated of a list. So the Class A subscribers basically, I guess it's easier to say what the Class A subscribers had rather than what the Class B subscribers did not have. So Class A subscribers would have a journal that would stay at the library that they could write their wish list sort of in. And the librarians would have to greet all of the Class A subscribers by name and say, oh, well, we have your book available for you. They had priority over the books that they requested. They were able to borrow books as soon as they came out, whereas the Class B had to wait a year until they came out. And they had the full attention of the librarian to help them with whatever it was that they wanted, which the Class B subscribers really didn't have access to. It's also really funny with the Book Lovers Library when new books came out. And so, like here in America, when a new book comes out, and also in Canada, if it ends up making its way on into Costco, it's a really big deal. Which is, it makes a huge difference in sales. Well, back in the day, if a book came out and it was initially put into the circulation at the book lovers library, it was a big deal. And from an author's perspective, I thought that that perspective was really kind of cool, that element.
How did you find out about this? I never heard about a book lovers or a lending library. How did you stumble upon it?
I was reading an article one day. I just love to read historical articles. I just, kind of poke around, and if something sounds interesting, I read it. And so I happened to read about the Book Lovers Library. And then I really just started sort of delving into research. And I mean, there's all different kinds of websites out there. And one of the things that I like the most about websites is when they include a bibliography. And then I can go into that bibliography and I can purchase the nonfiction books that had that information in there originally. So that's what I oftentimes will do when I'm sort of delving into a new idea. So I got all of these books and I started researching, and that's kind of where I found out about, when this was happening during the marriage bar, the women, which basically meant that when women got married, they had to give up their jobs so that they could be full-time wives and mothers. And apparently the women who worked for the Book Lovers Library had statistically longer engagements than women in other areas of employment because they loved their jobs so much they didn't want to give it up, even though they loved the person that they were married to. But then I started researching a little bit more, and I found all of these quirky patrons who frequented the Book Lovers Library. And with my book, The Book Lovers Library, the whole point of it really is not the whole point of it, but like essentially the plot is that the protagonist Emma is a widow and she has to send her daughter away during the evacuation of children during World War II, in England. And I knew that was going to be a very heavy topic, and I really wanted to have some levity and lightness to that. And so once I started to research the Book Lovers Library, I thought, oh, this is going to be a really lovely way to kind of offset some of that darkness and that hurt, and make it a little bit more fun and quirky, and add, of course, that bookish element that I love to incorporate into my books.
Mhm. Okay. And of course, I'm like you. I like to do research too, and you got me looking on this one. And I think Boots is in existence, but the library isn't because it took until 1964 for the Brits to agree that every town should have some sort of a library or something like that. I'm amazed at that.
It's really crazy. Yeah, once libraries ended up being more pervasive, really after the 1960s, that's when the Book Lovers Library and all of the other lending libraries really did kind of cease to exist, which is what makes Bromley House, the lending library that's still in existence in Nottingham today, such an unusual thing. But it really was such an amazing experience to get to go in. The people who worked there were incredibly kind. They let me come in. They gave me a whole tour of the entire place, which was just enormous. And they also let me work there for the entire day for free, it was really actually, I got so much wonderful research from it. So it was very, very helpful.
Did you like the customers, the patrons? Were they fun to deal with?
Oh, I didn't actually deal with any of the patrons myself, but the ones that I read about really were very fun. The ones who did come into the Boots Book Lovers Library. And I actually use those real life patrons to inspire some of the characters who come into the Book Lovers Library in my novel.
Very good. Now, you mentioned just a little bit about it, about how difficult it was for women like Emma, who's your main character, to get jobs in the beginning of World War II, that period set 37, 38, that time period. Why was that exactly? What was the status of women back then?
So, when women got married, they did, like I said, they had to give up their jobs. So, women who were single could work, and widows could work if they did not have children. However, when a widow had a child, she was still considered like being a mother was considered to be her full time job. And so now this was, of course, for more of an elevated area of employment. If you wanted to work in a factory, it wouldn't have been such a big deal. However, factories also wanted to hire girls that were straight out of high school who could learn things quickly, had sharp eyes, and could really be in employment for a while. But if you wanted to work as a secretary or a library or as a shop girl, there are going to be a lot more strict social rules that you have to comply with. One of those being that you shouldn't have any children and that you should be completely single. So having a child, even though Emma was a widow, still really was prohibitive for her being able to find a good job. And so, of course, Mrs. Bainbridge ends up taking a chance, or Miss Bainbridge ends up taking a chance on her and hires her. But it really was a very difficult thing. Emma was very lucky that I wrote it, that her husband had paid into this pension, because they did have a widow's pension available and they had pension for the children as well. However, it was only if the husband had paid into this for X number of years for it to be applied at the time of his death. And so she did at least receive that. And it was interesting. They would get like a whole booklet of those pension coupons. They would take one off, and they had one specific day during the week that they could go to the post office to keep from like cluttering it up, or they would cash in that coupon to receive the money that they would get for that particular week. And but aside from that, women who were widows with children were basically expected to rely on their families to help them out, or the more obvious choice that everybody just kind of expected them to do was to remarry. And that was pretty much what their options were.
Hmm. Wow. Wow. That's still the vestiges of the old days there, and boy, oh boy, that luckily things had changed and were changing at that time period. Well, so that's really simple. Now, one of the things that is a big part of this book, one of the things really a big part, is that now Emma has a daughter named Olivia. Okay, and Olivia is, I think, 8 years old, and she is Emma, being she, is told basically you should send your daughter away. Tell us a little bit about that whole situation there.
So when the children's evacuation happened in September 1939, the children were requested to be moved from areas that were potential bombing sites. So, of course, big cities like London, but also Nottingham. Even though it wasn't a big city, they had a lot of factories that were located there that were producing arms, which, of course, made it a target for Germany to try to attack. So, these children were basically taken to the school where they were put onto buses, and that's where the parents said goodbye to them. From the buses, they were taken to the train station and put on trains. As a parent, you didn't know where they were going to go. You didn't know who they were going to be living with. And you also didn't even know how long they were going to be gone for. So, if a parent gave their children, or not gave their children, if the parent let their child be evacuated at that start in 1939, and they did not bring them home until the government cleared children to come home, those children would have been gone for 6 years. I can't even imagine. And so when I first read about this, it's called Operation Paul, sorry, it's called Operation Pied Piper. And when I first heard about this was when I was writing The Last Bookshop in London. And as a mother, that really stuck with me, wondering, oh my gosh, I can't imagine sending my child away. And then, especially when you read about the horrific experience of the children upon their arrival. And now, bear in mind that the trains were all running very late because of all the troops being sent abroad, people traveling back and forth. So, these trains, what could have taken a couple of hours, might have taken a couple of days. So these kids finally arrive. They're tired, they're dirty, they're hungry, and they get lined up. And the people who have agreed to take these kids into their homes get to choose which children they want and which ones they don't. And so, of course, all the pretty little girls get picked. All of the tall, brawny boys get picked because they get basically used as farm labor. And all of the kids who get left behind, there's always going to be a few who nobody wants. And that, as a mother, also really stuck with me because every parent likes to think of their child as being this amazing, wonderful, beautiful, special being that the world has been gifted. And to think of nobody wanting your child is really just heartbreaking. And so yeah, absolutely. And so the whole concept of Operation Pied Piper really stuck with me, and I really had always wanted to explore sort of Emma's, like the mother's perspective, which is what led to me writing this book and writing Emma.
I spoke with an author last year who wrote a book about growing up in the 1940s. He touched upon this, the evacuation. Um, but also in his research, he said this had been planned since 1925. I was unaware that the British were so sure something was going to be happening with the Germans that they had already started planning evacuations that far in advance, and that just stunned me. And no one knew it. That's the thing. Yeah, wow. So, well, now we've got a situation here. We're getting the outlines of the book. We have Olivia, who's working at the no, Olivia's 8. She's not working anywhere. She's going out. She's going out to the farm. We have Emma, who's in the bookshop. We have a whole host of wonderful things here. But chapter 7, I want to talk about chapter 7, folks. You know, I read a lot of pages. I read a lot of chapters. Specific chapters don't always hit me. This chapter hit me. Chapter 7 is most of the emotionally gut-wrenching chapter I thought of the entire book. Could you talk a little bit about that chapter, please?
Thank you. And it was a really hard chapter to write as well. So chapter 7 is basically where Emma has to take her daughter Olivia to the school for her to be dropped off, where she is going to be going and being evacuated. And it's one of those things where, as a parent, you know that there are things that you have to do. Now, something to keep in mind as well is that there was a lot of peer pressure and government pressure for these parents to send their children away. I mean, essentially, there were posters up that said, if you don't send your children to the country, you're supporting Hitler, which, is like horrific if you think about that. And so they were given a choice, but also kind of not really. And so Emma is taking Olivia and dropping her off at the bus station. And there's this one part of the scene where, and even kind of beforehand, getting her ready, knowing that she's going to be leaving, and almost sort of that difficult moment where all the busyness stops, and now all you have left is to say goodbye. And like you've been trying to rush and put that off for as long as you can, and then that moment is finally upon you, and it's horrific. And so she takes her daughter to the bus, to the school where the bus comes and picks her up. And as Olivia is walking away, she's trying so hard to be strong. And this actually was kind of taken from my youngest daughter, who always made the honor roll assembly when she was in elementary school. So I would always go so I could see her get her award. And it was always on my lunch break. And every time I would leave, she would just burst into tears. But she tried so hard not to. And you could see that battle, that internal battle where she was trying so hard to be brave and not cry. And that heartbreaking moment when her face just crumpled and you saw her lose the battle, and she just, gave in to her emotions. And so writing that scene where Olivia does leave really, really was so painful. And I totally cried when I wrote it because I kept thinking about my little girl and having to leave when she was at her honor roll assembly. And I just can't even imagine her not seeing Emma not seeing Olivia for who knows how long. And then of course, there is just of course that starkness when you get home and you realize that suddenly the house has lost its heartbeat and its most important occupant, and it's just empty.
Your life becomes extremely empty when your child's not there. No doubt about it.
Absolutely.
You don't know where they are. Like you said, you don't know for how long. And
Yeah. Or even when you'll hear from them.
that's right. We're not going to get into all of those things, but you know, I think the situation with Olivia is not unreal. I think it was a very real situation. A lot of these kids got put in pretty lousy places, and actually, of the two places she ended up, the first one was probably better than the second one. But wow, they're all hard living, hard living. And these kids weren't used to that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually reading about some of the East End kids because the East End kids in London, they unfortunately really just didn't have the opportunity to have the education that a lot of other kids did. Maybe they had to stay home and help take care of their parents. Maybe they had to try to find jobs as newsboys or something, but they didn't have the education that other kids did in more affluent areas. And so when some of these kids went into the country, they didn't know what a cow was, which is crazy to think about because we as kids we've all grown up with these board books that, oh, the cow says moo and pig says oink, but they didn't have those things. And can you imagine seeing a cow for the first time as like an 8 or 9 year old and being like, what is that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, one of the things that I think really, really fleshes out the book uh, and brings out a lot of the history of the time period are your use of these supporting characters in the book. And one of my favorites is a girl named Margaret. Now, I think she wants to keep pushing off her engagement. She doesn't want to stop working, okay? But tell us a bit about Margaret because she was something else.
Yeah, so Margaret was a really fun character to write. She was a great character for me to illustrate sort of that concept that I had mentioned before about the women who loved working at Boots Booklover's library so much that they pushed off their engagement because she very much does love her fiance. but she also very much loves her job. And the concept of having to get married, not having to get married, but getting married and having to give up her job as her fiance is being deployed. So just thinks, what am I going to do? Just sit here and just wait for him and wait for letters and keep an empty house? So it made it even more difficult for her to want to get married because of everything that she would lose and the busy distraction. But with Margaret, she also was a really great character for me to sort of, because she's very fashionable and very beautiful. And so Boots has this cosmetic line called Number Seven. And it was a huge thing back in the 40s because it was sort of an affordable cosmetic for women who ordinarily couldn't afford cosmetics because it was so cost prohibitive. But at Number Seven cosmetics are actually still in Boots Chemist today. And so it was really kind of fun to get to use Margaret to explore a little bit of that. So all of the lipstick colors that are mentioned in there are actual lipstick colors that were available at that particular time in history. And it all is, really on par. And so she's almost kind of this woman that people come to for makeup advice. And so it was a really fun kind of character for me to write. And she also, she had a father, and this was so fun about you guys being books and looks for your podcast, because with her father, he would always tell her that she was just books and looks, meaning that all she did was, she was a beautiful girl who liked books, and that was essentially what summed her up. Although obviously that was more of a derogatory sort of comment than you guys being books and looks with your really awesome name for your podcast. So and it was funny because when you and I actually had chatted about the Keeper of Hidden Books, I had already written that scene where her father had said all she was books and looks, and so it was so
Mm.
funny
Yeah.
that it kind of worked out that way.
Yeah. Wow. Well, one of the things she did, and again, this is what I'm talking about. The research here is out of this world. M- Margaret took bile beans. Now, I never heard what the devil is a bile bean?
Yeah, so bile beans were basically they were these, I don't even know what the ingredients were, but basically it promised women energy and being thin. And I'm sure that it was some kind of an appetite suppressant. But women were basically pitched these in magazines saying, "Oh, if you take these, you'll be bright-eyed and energetic and thin." And so, I mean, it's just like how we fall prey to advertisement as well. I mean, how many times are we on Facebook and end up scrolling around on a website we never would have gone to if it didn't pop up in our feed? So, they very much were just as susceptible to all of those advertisements, Wild Beans absolutely being one of them.
Okay. But, and here's a big but now, she doesn't recommend bile beans for Emma. She tells her you should be taking, when they get it here, what are they called? I think they're called Beecham's. Beecham's pills. Now, what's a Beecham pill?
So, I think they were basically the same thing, just with different titles to appeal to different women. Because, of course, a woman who has had a kid and is exhausted isn't going to be looking at something that's advertised for a woman in her 20s and think, oh, that's going to work for me. I mean, I personally, I'm in my mid 40s, and whenever I see advertisements pop up and it's some 20-year-old being like, this made my skin so firm, I'm like, yeah, girl, you're in your 20s. Of course, your skin is firm. That's not going to help me. I'm going to go to somebody who's in her 40s selling me makeup. So I'm pretty sure that it was sort of along the same strategic marketing line, in that perspective.
It had soap in it. That's what I was looking at. I went to the website and it said it contains soap. Who wants to drink soap?
That's a good appetite suppressant, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe even a bit laxative. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you got it there. And then Margaret had, and again, folks, Margaret's just one of my favorite characters. Margaret put on liquid stockings. What the dickens is liquid stockings?
Right. So stockings ended up that you could make them because they were made out of silk back then, and silk was needed to be preserved so that they could use it for parachutes. And so now women didn't have stockings, which, like, it's funny. I was actually having a conversation with somebody the other day about growing up and having to always wear pantyhose. And then I moved to Florida and nobody wore pantyhose. And I was like, I am never leaving Florida again. But back in the day, they all had to always wear their silk stockings. To do so was really just unseemly. And so when they had to stop having the silk, and of course they all eventually started to run without being able to be replaced, they had to find alternatives. So they did have something that was like a liquid stocking. You could go and you could put that on, but of course, it's hard to find a color that matches your exact skin tone. And then you also could have just drawn a line down your leg, which is what some women did. And then sometimes you just were in a pinch and you couldn't find anything else, and so they did what Margaret did and put gravy on her legs. And sometimes you could use tea as well, and it basically would just stain the skin, which, as you know, Mrs. Pickering's dog, Tubby, he was very excited about her gravy laden legs, and had to take a little sample. And just a little FYI for any other bleeding hearts out there, Tubby stays completely safe throughout the entire book. Any book that I write, if I have any animals, they will always stay safe because I am a bleeding heart and I love them just as much as you do.
Good. Well, that's the gravy. Yeah, I love that. And Mrs. Pickering, she's something too. She owns a house in which she lets that's where Emma lives and another gentleman live. And you use her very well to bring out something called the WVS. Now, what is or was, I don't know if it's still in existence, was the WVS?
So that's a women's voluntary service. And basically, they were sort of a catch all for anything that needed to be done. If you would imagine all the busybody women in your neighborhood with nothing to do, finding something to do, this was their task. And there was no job too great or too small for them to manage. They really were sort of the heartbeat of the children's evacuation. They managed a significant portion of it. They made sure that soldiers had care packages to receive. They knit socks and scarves for soldiers. And they also ran the mobile canteens. And one of the things that I thought was really cool when I was doing research about it is that they would accept, especially later on in the war, there was a clothing ration as well. And so they would accept people's donations of clothing. They would repair them and they would wash them. And then they had a system that they would shuffle them around the country. So if you received a donation in London, say, you might you might actually have all of those clothes sent to Nottingham, which was like a 2-hour train ride away, because you didn't want anybody to ever put on an outfit and be walking on the street and somebody say, "Hey, that used to be my dress." They wanted it all to be new and fresh for all of the recipients. And it's those little things that really build such a wonderful sense of morale and community. And they really put so much thought into their work. And Mrs. Pickering was certainly she was born to be with the WVS.
Right. Well, she became so much more than a landlady, and I really loved how you brought in the WVS and all they did for the guys coming back from Dunkirk and from the front or going to the front, and all the other people who were dispossessed because of the bombing that did occur in the cities, and very well done on that. One person I hadn't mentioned to you, talked to you about, but there's a gentleman who comes in who hates mystery books, okay, or so he says. Tell us a little about this guy,
Oh
because he
gosh,
was another
Mr.
he was a
Beard.
corker.
Mr. Beard, I think Mr. Beard is everyone's favorite character. He really is such a fun character. So it was interesting kind of going back to like how novels were really a big at this particular time period in history, because in the 20s and 30s, you really had a lot more mysteries and romances coming out, more so than you ever did before. And there was this very sort of elitist group of people who felt that classics were really the only way to go. And all of these romances and mysteries that were coming out were essentially dumbing down London's literacy rates and education overall, or England's. And so I used Mr. Beard to really illustrate this particular point. So whenever he comes in, he always talks about how he wants a classic, but really deep down at his heart, this man loves a good mystery. And so it's sort of this little thing that people have to skirt around to try to make sure that he gets the book that he wants, which is never the book that he says that he wants. But also, he's part of something called mass observation, which was this really wonderful initiative where hundreds of people wrote down their thoughts and feelings towards events that were transpiring every single day. And it actually started back during the Simpson scandal, when the king was going to be abdicating the throne to marry this American divorcee. And so they wanted people to write down their emotions and feelings. And this kind of just sort of segued into the start of World War II. And they said, keep writing. So everybody kept writing about all of their experiences, and it was seen as a little controversial because neighbors and friends and family didn't necessarily give their permission to be written about. And sometimes these little exploits would appear in newspapers and everybody would read about them. So you never knew what kind of juicy scandals might be, unearthed in the mass observation. But I had Mr. Beard also be part of the mass observation. And so he has this little notebook that he carries around with him everywhere and a pencil. And back then, the pencils didn't always start to work right away when you'd start to use them. So you had to give them a quick little lick and then you could start writing. And so he's always got this small pencil and this notebook that he and the pencil that he has to kind of lick and then start writing. And you don't know what he's writing, but you know it's about you.
It's true. Very true. Well, now we talk about, you talk about 2 books in particular that, I've read them both. One of my favorite, The Mask of Demetrius by Eric Ambler. What a great book that was. And I was shocked when you threw in The Mask of Demetrius. Oh, why was that part of this book? What was this?
So that book had actually just came out around this time period in history, and I really try very hard to make things historically accurate, even the books that are used in the plot. And so The Mask of Demetrius was definitely one of those, and it was a really great sort of adventure mystery sort of book to throw in there. And I felt like it was also really illustrative too of that particular time period and the books that were really starting to come out and how people just really craved excitement and adventure from those novels.
Yeah, that's good. You ever read it?
Um, I did not end up reading that one, no. I didn't get a chance to. I had a lot of books that I had to do
Yeah,
for
that's
research.
okay. Eric Ambler considered the godfather, the grandfather of all these espionage books. He's a wonderful writer, wonderful books. So I like that one. But then you have again another one of my favorites, Anne of Green Gables. You have Lucy Maud Montgomery there. How did that blend in, and how did you incorporate that into your book? Because that was very, very well done.
Thank you. Yeah, Anne of Green Gables is one of my favorites. That was another one that I really enjoyed as a little girl, where I felt like I was kind of like the overthinker, and I was incredibly shy. And when I would talk, I was a reader, so I always used bigger words than everybody else did, and I felt silly for it. And then I read about Anne Shirley, and I didn't feel so very silly anymore. And so I knew that I wanted to incorporate Anne of Green Gables into this book, especially with Olivia. And, I wanted Olivia's character to really not necessarily be a very good student and not really be a reader. And as Emma's father, who used to own a bookstore, said, "There, every one of us is a reader. You just haven't found the right book yet." And so for Olivia, Emma finding Anne of Green Gables and kind of coercing her into an interest in wanting to read it really was an integral part of Olivia's relationship with books going forward.
Yeah, to the point where she even tried to, Emma tried to, Olivia. I get these 2 girls. I get confused here. Olivia tried to pattern herself after Anne when she went off to live with her paternal grandparents for a while.
She did, yeah. Yeah, because you know how books ignite the imagination, and that was really demonstrative of that with Olivia, kind of seeing a difficult situation ahead of her and thinking, "I'm going to fall back on something that I love in books and try to make this better."
It is, and it works, folks. It does work. Read to your kids. I remember sitting down one time with my 2 kids, a long time ago. I read the Ken Follett book, Whiteout, to them. Wonderful book. The beginning, I got to hear the moaning and the groaning and everything else. The next thing, it's like, okay, let's go to the next chapter. Let's go to the next chapter. Yep. It hooks kids. And that's something you got to do. And that's something you want to do with this book, because this book will hook you. This is a great, great book for you to read yourself. Read it to your kids. It is wonderful. Which takes me to the next question. You are putting out one after another great books. What's next for Madeline Martin?
Thank you so much. So my next book is actually Victorian era, and it's called The Secret Book Society. And it is basically about a young countess who has been widowed 3 times. And yes, there is definitely some gossip going on about that. She finds out that these women around her are having their reading materials suppressed by their husbands. And so she opens her very extensive library to these women and invites them over for tea. And they don't just talk about gossip or about even the books that they read, their conversations become very subversive. And that's about all I can say right now. But I will say that as of September 2025, you are cordially invited to the Secret Book Society.
Okay. And now is this another one steeped in heavy history?
Yes, I've done significant amounts of research for this one as well.
Good, good, good. That's glad. And do you have the next one in your mind already? Is it
I
already
do.
germinating? You do. Oh my God.
I actually just recently signed a 2-book deal. So I have the first book, it will be coming out in 2026. I'm not sure exactly the month yet, but this one is tentatively called A Time of Witches, and it's a dual timeline about a contemporary woman who is linked to another woman in the mid 1600s in England who is part of the witch trials.
Okay.
And again, there'll be a lot of history there as well. And I don't know what 2027 will be, but there will be a book in 2027. I just don't know what it will be yet.
Now I'm gonna ask this. Gotta go one step further. I said this is phase two. I'm waiting for you to come out with it for books that feature a strong lead male character. Are you thinking of that at all? Sometime, possibly, maybe, huh?
No, I honestly, I wrote a lot of male characters when I wrote my romances. And no offense, but I enjoy being in the mind of a woman a little bit better.
You know, you look at the historical fiction writers. I was talking to my wife about this the other day. Why are so many of you women? It's like the men have almost vacated the genre, and it's up to you women to keep it going. I don't know why that is, but it's a fascinating thing. Well, I'm telling you what, you keep writing them, I'll keep reading them, we'll keep chatting, and hopefully there'll be no hurricane to mess things up the next time we come.
Right?
Okay. Here it is. There it is. The Book Lovers Library by Madeline Martin. There she is. There's that little hole right there. That's the one we're looking at there. That you put the thing through, right? The eyelet there. Yep, there it is. And so, yeah, wonderful book, wonderful, wonderful stuff. Thank you, thank you so much for being with us today, Madeline, on Books and Looks.
Absolutely my pleasure, Blaine. Thanks so much again for having me back.
Well, friends, I hope you had a good time listening to Madeline. I loved it. I absolutely love her writing. I love her heavy history that she has. You know, that's what I like. I like a historical book that is deep in history and she fills it in. She fleshes it in with these fictional characters to bring things out, like that Mrs. Pickering, who's a side character, and yet she talks about the WVS because of her. It's a very, very good book. You don't want to miss this one. What am I looking at? Well, next week we're getting into the opioid situation. That's right. I've got another novel for you, and this one you want to pay attention to because this is written by a lady named Laura Essay, who was an assistant attorney general out in Nebraska. It's called "Side Effects Are Minimal." And it's all about opioids and an opioid trial. And I think you're going to really learn. I learned a lot about opioids. I mean, we all hear about it. Okay. It's all over the news. I don't know much about it. I don't know how it goes about. I don't know how they're developed. I didn't realize that one thing leads to something else. And so I found out a lot, really a lot. I think I'm going to really enjoy this book. Side Effects Are Minimal. Next week with Laura Essay. So anyway, on behalf of our new website, booksandlookspodcast.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book. So long.